Chapter 18 The Progressive Era, 1900 to 1916. Part 1. On March 25, 1911, a fire erupted at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City. The employees, mostly young Jewish and Italian immigrant women earning as little as $3 per week working sewing machines, could not escape from the building's top 3 floors. The owners locked doors to stop theft and bathroom breaks, and fire truck ladders only reached the 6th floor. 46 women jumped to their deaths, while 100 more died inside. The Triangle's workers had already made labor history in 1909 when they tried to join the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and were fired. This sparked a general walkout of garment workers, the uprising of the 20,000, in which workers demanded, among other things, better safety in clothing factories. The strike led to the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU, contract with hundreds of firms. Triangle was not among them. The Triangle Fire drew attention to the social divisions in America in the 20th century's first 2 decades, a period known as the Progressive Era. Urbanization and labor conflict raised the issue of the government's responsibility to intervene in the economy and mitigate social inequalities. Progressive was a term describing a loosely defined movement to bring about significant change in American society and politics and included businessmen who recognized the legitimacy of unions, women's reformers who wanted protections for women and children, and social scientists who believed research could solve social problems. Everywhere economic and political consolidation was apparent in America, from Wall Street's growing power to corrupt urban political machines. Progressive mounted a variety of efforts to preserve individual freedoms and personal self-determination, and sometimes even suppress them in a rapidly changing nation. In the Progressive Era, the economy grew enormously as industrial production increased, the population boomed, and the consumer marketplace expanded. For the last time, farms and cities grew together, and agriculture entered its golden age, with growing cities demanding more agricultural goods. But the city was the focus of progressive politics and the new mass consumer society, and the number of cities in the United States with a population of more than 100,000 grew. The inequalities of urban life apparent in the 1890s persisted, with immigrants living in slums and the very wealthy living in isolated neighborhoods and luxurious mansions. J.P. Morgan's financial firm directly or indirectly controlled 40% of all financial and industrial capital in the nation, while more than a third of mining and factory workers lived in poverty. The cities attracted writers and artists who captured its dynamism and modernity. Others saw cities as places where corporate greed eroded traditional American values. A new generation of journalists writing for mass circulation national magazines exposed the problems of industrial and urban existence. Lincoln Steffen's series for McClure's, published as The Shame of the Cities, showed how party bosses and businessmen profited from political corruption. In the same magazine, Ida Tarbell pointed out to the arrogance and economic machinations of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. Theodore Roosevelt criticized this kind of journalism, calling it muckraking. Novelists produced similarly critical works of fiction, such as The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, whose descriptions of unsanitary slaughterhouses and rotten meat led directly to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug and Meat Inspection Acts. Most characteristic of early 20th century cities was the presence of immigrants. The new immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe reached its peak in the Progressive Era. Between 1901 and 1914, about 13 million immigrants came to the United States, mostly from Italy, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This wave of immigration was part of a global process of immigration caused by industrial growth and agricultural decline. Between 1840 and 1914, when World War I halted migration from Europe, nearly 40 million people emigrated to the United States and another 20 million moved to other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Elsewhere in the world, millions more people migrated at the same time, mostly in Asia, where they moved to Southeast Asia and the South Pacific from India and China, and from Russia and Northern Asia to Eastern and Central Asia. While many of these immigrants, pushed and pulled by a variety of factors, moved to America freely, not all emigrated as free labor. Large numbers of Chinese, Mexican, and Italian migrants were bound to long-term labor contracts signed with labor agents who provided the contract workers to American employers. Most European immigrants to America entered through Ellis Island in New York Harbor, which became the main facility for processing immigrants. Those who failed the medical examination or were judged to be anarchists, prostitutes, or otherwise undesirable were sent home. At the same time, Asian and Mexican migrants came to the American West, mostly through San Francisco. Although Japanese migration was considerable, Mexican migration was much larger. Between 1900 and 1930, nearly 1 million Mexicans came to the United States, mostly through Texas, and many became cheap agricultural labor. By 1910, one of every 7 people in America was foreign-born, the highest percentage in American history. More than 40% of New York's population was born abroad, as was more than 30% in other major cities like Chicago and Milwaukee. While many immigrants moved west, most settled in industrial centers. The new immigrants imagined America as a land of freedom, where everyone enjoyed equality before the law, worshipped as they pleased, found economic opportunity, and was emancipated from their homeland's oppressive social hierarchies. While some, such as Jews fleeing religious persecution in Russia, intended to settle permanently, most planned to earn money to return home and buy land. Groups such as the Irish and Mexicans had many such birds of passage who stayed only briefly in the United States. The new wave of immigrants settled mostly in close-knit ethnic neighborhoods with their own businesses and community organizations, and continued to speak their own language and published foreign language newspapers and other publications. Churches were central in these communities. Although most immigrants earned more in the United States than they could have at home, they faced long hours, low wages, and dangerous working conditions in the mines, factories, and fields. Cities were also the birthplace of mass consumption society that gave new meaning to American freedom. The promise of American life had always in part resided in the enjoyment of goods that in other nations were available only to the wealthy. Only in the Progressive Era, however, did large downtown department stores, chain stores in cities, and retail mail-order houses for rural residents make accessible the goods produced in America's factories. Though low wages, unequal income distribution, and Southern poverty limited the extent of the consumer economy before World War I, in the Progressive Era mass consumption became a cornerstone of American freedom, understood as the abundance of goods was offered by modern capitalism. Leisure activities also were part of mass consumption, with mass entertainment in amusement parks, dance halls, and theaters attracting large crowds. In this period, motion pictures also became a mass phenomenon, in which even working-class moviegoers attended the Nickelodeons. Traditional gender roles also changed dramatically as women were newly visible in public places such as workplaces, stores, and sites of entertainment. More and more women worked at wages, and although black and immigrant women were still confined to low-paid, low-skilled jobs, native-born white women found expanding opportunities in white-collar work. Women workers were no longer only young, unmarried white women and adult black women, and working women became symbols of female emancipation, showing economic independence from men and moving beyond their traditional roles as wives and mothers. Their desire to participate in the new mass consumer society caused many women, both native and immigrant, to earn money independently of their families, sometimes causing great friction, especially in immigrant families. Fewer individuals were more wrapped up in the new consumer society than Henry Ford. Ford didn't invent the automobile, but he did create production and marketing techniques that brought it within the reach of ordinary Americans. In 1905, he founded the Ford Motor Company, only one of many small automobile manufacturers at the time. In 1908, he introduced the Model T, a simple and light vehicle that could stand the country's poor roads. Ford focused on standardizing output and lowering prices in order to bring a luxury good to the masses of consumers. In 1913, Ford's Highland Park, Michigan factory adopted the moving assembly line, in which car frames were brought to workers on a continuously moving conveyor belt. This process allowed Ford to vastly reduce the time it took to produce an auto and thus greatly expanded his output. In 1914, Ford raised his wages to an unheard $5 per day, allowing him to attract skilled workers. But assembly line work was monotonous, and Ford used spies and armed detectives to prevent his employers from unionizing. Ford justified the high wages by arguing that workers needed to be able to afford the goods being produced by America's factories. By 1916, Ford's Model Ts were affordable for many workers. The economic system based on mass production and mass consumption came to be called Fordism. As production shifted from capital goods like steel, railroad equipment, and so on, to consumer products, a new advertising industry perfected ways to increase sales, often by linking goods with the idea of freedom. Many products used liberty as a brand name or used images of liberty as a sales device. Elder Feline, a department store magnate, called consumerism a school of freedom, as consumers made individual choices on basic questions of living. Abundance came to define the American way of life, in which personal fulfillment was attained through acquiring material goods. But if abundance's promises shifted the search for freedom to the private life, it inspired political activism as those excluded from mass consumption demanded inclusion. The desire for consumer goods led many workers to join unions and demand higher wages, and the claim that monopolistic corporations artificially raised prices at the expense of consumers became a weapon against the trusts. The consumer economy birthed ideas that offered a new language for criticizing inequalities of wealth and power. In his book, A Living Wage, in 1906, Father John A. Ryan suggested that a decent standard of living was a natural and absolute right of citizenship. Ryan attempted to translate into America's terms Pope Leo XIII's Declaration of 1894, Rerum Novarum, which endorsed social justice over competitive and individualistic competition. Demands for a living wage and a decent standard of living were part of the promise of the Progressive Era, in which some predicted that want and scarcity were disappearing, with capitalism providing abundance and leisure for all.